To this morning's evidence session, the second in our scrutiny of the Railways Bill, which had its second reading in the House of Commons yesterday, top billing on the TV. We'll be hosting three panels today. During our first panel, we'll be hearing from passenger organisations. On our second panel, we'll be hearing from independent ticket retailers. And in our final panel, we'll be hearing from Transport Focus about plans for the creation of the new passenger watchdog. So could I please ask our first panel of witnesses to introduce themselves, starting with Ben.
Good morning, committee. My name is Ben Plowden. I'm the Chief Executive of the Campaign for Better Transport. We're a national charity campaigning for better, more sustainable transport choices in all communities in England and Wales.
Good morning, committee. I'm Sue Sharp. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee, otherwise thankfully known as DIPTAC, which is the government's statutory advisors on transport and mobility, and celebrated its 40th anniversary this year.
Thank you. Emma.
Good morning, I'm Emma Vogelman. I am one of the co-CEOs at the charity Transport for All. We are a disabled persons organisation focusing on all modes of transport and all disabled people across the UK.
Okay, well, welcome to you all. So I'll go in the same order. In your opinion, is the bill likely to produce a railway that better serves passengers than the current setup?
Chair, thank you. I think broadly, yes. We welcome the creation of Great British Rail. We've long argued for the creation of an integrated rail body, which Great British Rail will be. There are some important questions, I think, around issues such as affordability of fares, around whether there should be a duty on GBR and the Secretary of State to set out to increase passenger demand over time. There's some questions around the funding regime, and other issues such as open access and ticketing, but broadly we think overall GBR should improve conditions for passengers. The other thing I would say, there are a substantial amount of other things that need to be in place to ensure that that happens. So broadly speaking, the bill, you can't quantify it precisely, but will account for, let's say, 30% of what will need to be in place to make GBR an effective organisation. There's a long list of other things that will need to happen in terms of guidance, regulatory change, funding changes, all sorts of processes and documents that will need to be produced in the next couple of years once the bill is passed. And I think it's important to understand how the bill will intersect with those other processes and documents to understand whether that will produce a good outcome for passengers.
Thank you. Sue?
Yeah, from DIPTAC's point of view, I mean, we welcome the opportunity that the bill presents to improve the railway for passengers and putting passengers, and particularly disabled passengers, at the core of the network. I think the introduction of the passenger and accessibility duty, as we all know, is the first time that we've had that provision in legislation, so that is welcome. And I think it's particularly useful that it's not just applying to GBR, but to all of those involved in the rail industry. So from Secretary of State, Scottish and Welsh ministers, as well as ORR. I think in GBR, having one body that is both driving consistency of standards and bringing together the rail vehicles and the stations is a real opportunity to drive change for disabled people and to provide that consistency that is so often lacking. And one of the biggest barriers for many disabled people is having a lack of confidence in the system to be able to deliver the service reliably and accessibly. And I think we have an opportunity here to really deliver that change.
Thank you. And Emma?
I first want to completely echo what's been said by the other panelists, particularly the point around consistency for disabled passengers. The fragmentation of the rail industry has posed so many problems for disabled passengers. I think in this bill, as was mentioned, accessibility provisions are incredibly welcome, and the unifying of the railways is absolutely welcome. I do, however, have a number of concerns, which I think can turn into opportunities to really strengthen this legislation to make sure that accessibility is enforceable and that it is a overriding, consistent priority for GBR, as opposed to at the moment where we feel it's potentially not given enough enforcement power and is subject to political will in some instances where the Secretary of State has complete control over things like, licensing and standards.
Yeah, okay, and we'll probably delve into those issues in more detail in our subsequent questions. So, Alex.
Thank you, Chair. Looking at the bill, there's a section which has in it the general duties that apply to GBR, ministers and ORR, all of them. That is clause 18 of the bill. And these are general duties. Do you think that that clause is sufficiently targeted to compel GBR to act in the interests of passengers?
Well, it's very welcome that there is a duty to promote the interests of users and potential users, and including, as colleagues have said, in particular, disabled persons. We have a question around the difference in the duties between the way that freight is treated and passenger travel is treated. Yeah. So the duty on GBR and the Secretary of State in relation to passengers is to promote their interests, whereas it's in the interest of is to promote the use of the network for freight. Our view is that in order to strongly incentivise GBR, once it's set up to grow the network and to grow passenger demand, there should be equivalent duties in Section 18 and Section 17 around passengers, so that the GBR is required to promote the use of the network for passengers and future passengers, and a corresponding duty on the Secretary of State to set a passenger growth target. Our concern is that otherwise there's a risk that GBR might manage demand as a sort of steady state and achieve its other objectives without necessarily seeking to grow demand, either by expanding the network or making better use of existing capacity.
Thank you. Sue.
Yeah, I mean, I was particularly interested to read the submissions from Transport for All and the campaign for better transport on this particular point. Clearly, DIPTAC has a very different role to either of those organisations in terms of our relationship with the department in terms of being their advisors. But it's really important for us as well to be able to hear the views of others in the disability community in order to shape our thinking around this, and it's certainly something that we'll be reflecting on over the next few months as the bill goes through.
Would you like a target for passenger growth like Ben would?
I would. I can't speak on behalf of the whole committee, obviously, at this point, but I think what we would like to see is more disabled people having the confidence to travel by rail for all of the journeys that they want to make, whether that's social, for work, or for whatever reason.
Thank you. Emma?
Thank you. I think particularly with clause 18, the mention of disabled passengers in particular is in itself very welcome. However, to promote the interests is very vague. It doesn't have any real targets attached to it. There is no way to measure what good looks like. So we personally at Transport for All, we think that the current wording is a little bit too unenforceable. It doesn't guarantee improvements for disabled passengers. It doesn't deliver what those measurable outcomes or create any real accountability when looking at the desperate change that's needed in terms of accessibility. So Transport for All would very much suggest changing the wording to have a duty to actively and continuously improve accessibility across the rail network and to provide those outcomes and measurable outcomes year on year to make sure that progress is being made and that people are able to see what's changing year on year. Is accessibility actually improving, as we feel that accessibility really needs to be treated as a core strategic responsibility.
Thank you. You want me to ask about 18?
Well, I mean, I think what B?
Yes.
Yeah. It's a yes or no answer.
Okay.
But yeah.
This might be a bit of a technical question. So we've just been talking about clause 18, and within clause 18 it says that all of these duties are subject to maintaining sufficient network capacity, which is laid out in clause 63. Are you concerned about that at all, or do you think that that's sort of self-evident, that obviously there has to be sufficient capacity?
Well, I think that's linked to the question about a growth duty and a promote duty and a growth target, because if clause 63 assumes that the network is essentially fixed implicitly, and of course at any point in time it will be, won't it? But if GBR and the Secretary of State had a duty to promote use of the network for passengers and future passengers, including disabled passengers, and a growth target, you would then ask the Secretary of State to make sure the long-term rail strategy had a network expansion plan that would increase the capacity available to both current and future passengers to avoid crowding. So I think you need to link the clauses around duties and the long-term rail strategy to the clause about capacity duty. So capacity will be less of a constraint over time if the Secretary of State had a duty to set out how the network should be expanded over time. Sorry, that wasn't a yes or no answer, but...
No, I mean, quite honestly, I'm not an expert in the capacity planning for the network. I think probably DFT ministers would be better able to answer that question than myself. But as I understand it, in exercising any of this, they always have to have due regard to the general duties, including passengers and accessibility duty. So insofar as that's there.
Emma, finally? Yeah.
Thank you. I think my answer would be yes, there is certainly a concern that accessibility could be deprioritized in favor of other strategic goals. So short answer is yes, there is definitely concern.
Okay, thank you. There's just one thing we wanted to pick up on this general duty. So it's about how the general duty would be enforced. Have you any thoughts about who you think would be deciding whether the general duty has been met?
Do you mean the general duty, all of the general duties?
Well, yes.
So my understanding is, and I think there's a reference to this in one of the documents that was published alongside the bill, that there isn't going to be a hierarchy between the duties.
Right, exactly.
And GBR will have a duty to kind of balance between them. In fact, that word is used in the bill, and demonstrate how it's balanced. So I think the question will be how you judge whether the trade-off that may arise between different duties is being appropriately judged. And I assume that will be a job for a combination of the passenger watchdog and in particular cases the ORR. So they will be scrutinising GBR's performance along with the Secretary of State and ministers. Someone's assumption is that the combination of ministerial oversight plus the different regulatory and advisory bodies will be checking whether those trade-offs are being made appropriately in terms of GBR's both operational outcomes but also its wider public purpose outcomes.
Okay, thank you. Have we? Yeah, go on, Baggy.
Okay, cool. This one's for Emma. Morning, Emma. You said that in the general duty in the bill to promote the needs of disabled passengers, it's very vague and unenforceable. What would you like to see in the bill that would improve it?
Absolutely. So we would really like to see a dedicated statutory duty requiring continuous improvement on accessibility across the rail network. What we would also like to see is the Passenger Council be given enforcement powers and be able to impose a statutory duty on the ORR to act on accessibility issues within defined timeframes. We would really also like to see mandated disabled representation, including those with lived experience on that passenger council. Those are just some of the things that we'd like to see included that we think could really strengthen the commitment to accessibility. But as this committee knows extremely well from the report earlier this year, Access Denied, is that there is just not enough enforceable and explicitly enforceable legislation currently when it comes to transport, particularly for disabled people. So we really can't accept having a once-in-a-generation almost opportunity to change the rail network, continue to have this vague, unenforceable wording.
Okay, thank you. Ollie, you... Question three?
Yes, could we just explore, thank you Chair, could we explore a little bit more what some of you were saying about the need for an equivalent duty to the one for rail freight for growing passenger use of the railway. I suppose what the government has said, and or might say, or certainly has said to us or in the chamber, is that they feel that's inherent already in what GBR exists to do. So if that's the case, why do you feel a duty to grow passenger use of the railway is necessary?
It's particularly to Ben.
Yeah.
Really.
Oh, to Ben. Right, start with Ben. Lovely.
It seems to us that the logic would suggest that if it's important for GBR to have a kind of statutory incentive to promote a growth in freight traffic, it also ought to have a statutory incentive to do that for passenger growth. We know that the expansion and increasing capacity and connectivity in the rail network has huge social and economic benefits. Look at the Northumberland line that's recently reopened, look at Crossrail. So there are huge benefits from expanding network capacity, increasing the number of people who are able to travel by rail. And what's interesting, if you look at the bill, the service performance is defined in terms of reliability, including punctuality, and the avoidance or mitigation of overcrowding. There could be a scenario whereby GBR decided that in order to meet its reliability duty, it reduced services to smooth out service to improve reliability, and in order to avoid overcrowding, it then introduced fares that, as it were, choked off demand, as has been suggested might happen on the West Coast Main Line in the context of HS2. So might be scenarios where, for perfectly logical reasons internally, GBR might decide actually it didn't want to increase passenger demand either on a particular route or overall. So it just seems to us that it would be sensible to have an equivalent duty or pair of duties in the bill in relation to passenger demand as it has for freight. And GBR would need to, as we were just discussing, would need to trade or work out how to optimise that objective versus the other objectives it's got set out in the duties and functions.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move on now to the licence. Jacob.
Thank you. Just in terms of the licence, obviously we don't have sight of it yet, but what do you think needs to feature in there to best serve passengers, Sue?
Well, we already know that it will include accessibility requirements, but like everyone else, DIPTAC hasn't yet seen a draft of that. What I can assure the committee is that we will be seeing a draft of it before it goes out to consultation, and we'll be giving very careful consideration to what those accessibility requirements are to ensure that the needs of disabled passengers are fully reflected in that. And I think we would also expect that post-consultation we would also have the opportunity to advise ministers on the response to the comments that are made, and indeed what finally comes out.
I think the licence is going to be critical. There are various references in the documents the government published around a streamlined licence, so it'll be quite interesting to see what that means relative to the current licence that applies to Network Rail. The government, I think, is going to consult on the draft licence, so we'll all have a chance to look at it. I think the other point I would make is one I made earlier, which is that the licence will be one of many documents that the government will produce in the next year, 18 months. The long-term rail strategy, GBR will produce its business plan, there'll be the access and use policy, there'll be the new periodic review process, there'll be MOUs with ministers in Scotland and Wales, there'll be guidance on partnerships with mayoral combined authorities, guidance on the right to request full rail devolution. There's a huge amount of stuff still to come. So I think understanding how the licence intersects with those other documents and processes is going to be critical, because between them they will add up to the set of arrangements that determine whether GBR is successful or not for passengers. And I think we have to see the licence in the context of all the other things that will be guiding, directing, shaping what GBR does and how it invests in what it does operationally.
And just to your point about it's going to be a more streamlined licence, that's what the department has said. Have you got concerns about what that could mean for passenger outcomes, and if it might actually be a worse outcome for passengers?
I'm sure that won't be the intention, but I think it'll be very important to see how the licence reflects the functions and duties in the Act when it's passed, including potentially if the government does decide to introduce a passenger promote and growth target. So I think we have to see what the streamlining means in practice, and also how the licence, as they intersects with all the other things that will be in place.
Emma, did you have comments on that?
Yeah, I just want to come in briefly around the licensing. I suppose in the goal of being streamlined, we also don't want there to be a sort of too centralized source of power in terms of the Secretary of State potentially being the sole grantor and modifying of GBR license, and we don't want any of the conditions within licensing, particularly around accessibility, to be a political will. So very much interested in seeing what the draft license will look like.
And the bill makes changes to the ORR's role. So what are your reactions to their role in enforcing the licence? Have you got any thoughts around that?
It seems to be very important that the ORR continues to have that role. Quite a lot of what the ORR currently does will go to the new passenger watchdog, and quite a lot of its decision making will go, well, some of its decision making will go to ministers and some of it will go to GBR itself. So I think understanding, so ORR will have a smaller role, it seems to us, in the overall system of regulation oversight than it currently does, and quite a lot of what it does will go elsewhere. So I think, again, understanding what consequence the transfers of those powers and responsibilities will have for how the railway operates for passengers, I think is going to be really important. And we won't be able to do that, I think, until this whole system is in place and it's settled down, and that may take a while.
Yeah, I mean, it's given that bigger picture, I think, is from DIPTAC's perspective, wherever the licensing function sits, our focus always is to ensure that the needs of disabled passengers are addressed within it. And I think our unique position as being statutory advisors gives us that opportunity to be involved at every stage in the development, and as we see how the other documents that come out in terms of guidance, etc., fit around the whole package.
And if I can, yeah, thank you. I would say our recommendation in terms of the role of the ORR is to retain sort of the independent authority of the ORR. So we're definitely interested to see how that, as Ben mentioned, that transition of powers plays out, and how enforceability plays that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Over to Ollie again.
Sue, the previous government's version of this legislation did include a duty for DIPTAC to formally advise GBR. The current bill doesn't in the same way. So how do you expect that your organisation will interact with GBR, and do you think it will be purely through the Secretary of State?
Well, I think, as you say, it was the previous government's proposal that DIPTAC's remit would be extended, and that has this current government has decided that our role remains the same, and that the passenger watchdog will take on that passenger champion and explicitly the accessibility role. From DIPTAC's perspective, we are statutory advisors across all aspects of transport policy, so every mode of transport, including rail. And I think just in terms of that broader remit, we wouldn't have the resource to be able to address the depth that's required to drive the change in this place. I think the passenger watchdog, with its relationship with passengers, is in a good position to be able to draw on the evidence, etc., to see how the improvements are panning out, and indeed if they're not, what needs to happen. I think from our perspective, we will and we would expect to have a role in terms of any emerging findings that the watchdog reports back to the Secretary of State, how the trends that are coming through there might play out in changes as the system develops and as Ben said, and settles down. And also, of course, as DIPTAC, we're not just waiting to be asked for our advice. We can obviously take a proactive role in offering advice to the Secretary of State where we see and hear of things going on in the new framework that may not be in the best interests of disabled people.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, okay, now we're going on to the more questions on the passenger watchdog. Elsie.
I think
Baggy.
Oh, sorry, Baggy.
This one's for Ben. Ben, you've come out pretty strongly expressing your concern about the provisions for the new passenger watchdog to be grown out of transport. focus. You've said it will lack independence, power and resources to act effectively on behalf of passengers, or pretty strong stuff. Why is that, and what changes again do you think should be made to remedy this?
So the passenger watchdog will be taking on quite a lot of the passenger oversight functions currently carried out by the ORR. So for that reason alone, I think it's very important to understand what capacity it will have, what powers it will have, which will be, I suspect, be defined through secondary regulations. And I think it's because it will now play a very important role in overseeing what GBR does and the other operators do. I think it's very important that we're clear about its powers, and also, for example, how the board of the passenger watchdog are appointed. Is that going to be completely independent, so that it independently represents passengers, and also making sure that its relationship with the ORR is properly defined, because our understanding is that it will primarily have a kind of oversight and monitoring role, and will seek to engage with GBR if it thinks it's not doing its job properly, and then will pass to the ORR issues it feels it can't resolve through negotiation or conversation for ORR to enforce against the GBR's duties. So I think understanding that relationship is going to be very important as well.
See? Yeah.
Thank you. So, as a sort of follow-up, I wondered if the panel had thoughts about how the leadership of the passenger watchdog should be determined and appointed. And I'm particularly interested in understanding how we can ensure that a plurality of voices can be heard or maybe mandated on that body. Sue, have you got any thoughts on that, first of all?
I think in terms of the sort of governance structure of Transport Focus, I think we're still waiting to see how that will pan out. Clearly they have always had representation and engagement with disabled people as part of the work that they've been doing now. I can't imagine that will change, but it'll be important to see how it actually looks in the new framework and with its new duties. In terms of our relationship with Transport Focus, as in DIPTAC, we meet regularly, though probably not frequently, to discuss issues around transport and accessibility. I would fully expect that would continue and may well develop as they take on this bigger role in rail, which in turn will help us in our strategic role in advising the Secretary of State on the rail aspects.
Emma, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. I think in terms of the watchdog itself, I mean, I've briefly touched on this, but we feel very much that the Passenger Council really needs to be given enforcement powers to be able to take proper action on cases that are involving accessibility breaches, and we'd like to have a statutory duty on the ORR in cases where things do get referred up to them to act on those referrals made by the Passenger Council and to have those outcomes within a clear time frame. In terms of the makeup of the passenger watchdog, for us, currently we have a complete faith in Transport Focus. We also have a really positive relationship with them, and that regularly meet to talk about accessibility issues. However, we very much feel that lived experience of disability needs to have a formal role in this, and to have a statutory requirement for disabled people, some proportion, to be on that passenger council to really ensure that lived experience is going to be part of the decision making. So we would very much like to see that. In addition, we would also like to see a duty for the council to consult with disabled passengers and organizations representing disabled people where decisions that they are going to make could impact those with protected characteristics, particularly, from our perspective looking at disability.
Thanks, Emma. And just finally, a slightly different question from me for Ben, if that's all right. I know that Campaign for Better Transport has previously emphasised the importance of devolved authorities sort of throughout the bill. I just wondered whether you thought whether you think it's important that there are voices from the regions and nations with a seat at the table when it comes to the passenger watchdog in particular.
Yes, that's an interesting thought. It seems to me that the key stakeholders in the exercise of the passenger watchdog's functions should have seems to be some representation. So potentially you might, for example, ask the Urban Transport Group rather than an individual combined authority to represent that group of organisations on the board. That would be one way of doing that, because clearly how GBR interacts with the combined authorities in terms of their statutory role to be consulted, but also potentially asking for full rail devolution is going to be a really important part of whether and how well it works, I think, with the regions and localities. So I think that might be one interesting way of doing that.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Rebecca, did you want to come in on this one?
Just very briefly. I'm just wondering, on the face of all of this, in terms of the watchdog, whether you think it should have powers to enforce its findings.
Well, I think that's why I made the point about understanding the new relationship between the passenger watchdog and the ORR is going to be critical, because my understanding is that the ORR will remain the principal enforcer. The passenger watchdog will survey, will review, will monitor GBR's performance against the standards that it will set, will engage with GBR to remedy things where it thinks remedy is needed, and in the case where it can't get the desired outcome, will then pass to the ORR the act of enforcing. I think the question will be whether that process will be efficient and effective and work adequately in terms of passenger outcomes, whether passengers or disabled passengers. So I think that the jury is probably out by definition on that question. It might be the case that if it proves difficult for the passenger watchdog to get the outcomes it wants, it might then need to be given enforcement powers in some regards down the line potentially.
So you're effectively saying that there's a concern that there would almost have to be a second investigation if it went to the ORR, which then slows things down for passengers?
Yes, because my assumption is the process would happen where the passenger watchdog would hand over a whole set of documentation to the ORR and say we're not adequate, we're not satisfied with the response that GBR's given us or what they've done in response to our concerns, which we've seek to negotiate with them. Could you please now enforce against our finding of inadequacy? So that introduces a new process into the system, and the question is, will that be effective? Will it be efficient? And if not, should the passenger watchdog be given some enforcement powers as well?
Emma was nodding on that. I don't know whether you want to just briefly add anything.
Just completely echoing what Ben said, enforcement powers and that particular question around publishing their findings. I think, yes, that should be happening so that more accountability can be possible when looking at what gets passed up.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Baggy.
Okay, this one is for Sue, and I think you've covered some of this earlier, and feel free to add a bit more. But in your written evidence on the previous draft legislation, you talk about the collaboration with transport, focusing and advocating for disabled passengers. And how do you see DIPTAC's role in relation to the new passenger watchdog? And then more specifically, do you think DIPTAC should be a statutory consultee on GBR's licence or the standards developed by the watchdog?
Well, I'll take the last point first. In terms of GBR's licence, given our role, I keep saying this, as statutory advisors to the Secretary of State, we would expect, and indeed I'm quite positive, that we will see the draft licence before consultation and, as I say, responses thereafter. So in terms of providing additional statutory provision for us to be able to do that, I'm not sure that's necessary given the core provisions that we've got in the 85 Act that set DIPTAC up. In terms of our relationship with Transport Focus, like Emma, we have a good relationship established already. I think it will be important from our point of view in terms of reviewing and shaping our future advice to the Secretary of State that we continue that engagement to understand what is going on essentially at the coalface, because we are slightly removed from that. And I think one of the other aspects too, that the complaints resolution is a really important part of what the watchdog will be able to do, and that's something that has been a real problem for disabled people in terms of knowing who to complain to, who's going to take that forward. So having that independent dispute resolution provisions within Transport Focus will be really important, and we'd like to understand what those complaints are so that we can see whether the advice that we are giving remains relevant, appropriate, or whether we should be recommending anything else.
Okay, thank you. Right, now we're going to go on to fares and ticketing. Alex.
Thank you, Chair. This one's to Ben, please. Is there any indication that fares will become more affordable for passengers because of any provision in the bill?
I think that is the proverbial $64,000 question, isn't it? So we made the point in our submission around two things. First of all, the definition of affordable in the government's documents has changed subtly but significantly between the consultation document and the response to the consultation, where the new definition seems to be much more about the affordability of the railway for taxpayers through the amount of money that the Treasury might need to invest in railway infrastructure and operations. So I think the issue for us is whether and how the bill could require the Secretary of State to take into account passenger affordability in the guardrails and parameters that she sets out, if it's the current Secretary of State for Great British Rail, when she's giving guidance or direction on fare setting. And it would seem to us to be sensible to include some reference to the need to take account of passenger affordability in the bill, so that the Secretary of State needs to explain what they've done around taking account of income in particular. Our research shows that almost half of people we've talked to think that the cost of rail travel is the main reason why they don't travel by rail either at all or more. So I think building affordability in terms of passenger affordability into the bill in some way, I think would be very helpful.
Okay, thank you. Right, does Sue or Emma want to come in particularly on affordability? Yes, Emma. Okay.
I could, thank you, just briefly, completely echoing Ben's point around we have also found that one of the primary reasons that disabled people don't travel by rail is by cost. Just want to mention that separate to the bill, but in the accessibility roadmap that has accompanied the bill, which sets out some of the plans for accessibility on rail, looking at the expansion of the disabled person's rail card has been looked at, which we would very much be in favor of to make sure that more people are able to access that concession. However, it has to be mentioned that this is in conjunction with the current discussions around potentially reducing the amount of people on disability benefits, which will inevitably mean that less people are eligible for that disabled person's rail card. So we're very much also looking into the affordability aspect, particularly in light of those concessions.
Chair, if I could just make one other point, apologies. We were very supportive of the fares freeze announced in the budget, the first for 30 years, which hopefully gives an indication that passenger affordability is going to be a consideration in the Secretary of State's decision-making around fares guidance. But let's wait and see what happens in terms of what that guidance says.
And if I could just add, it's accessibility as well as affordability. So accessibility to the tickets. And Emma's absolutely right in terms of the roadmaps, very welcome. News on the expansion of the disabled person's rail card, but also the plans to improve the vending machines from which you can access these tickets, which have been less than accessible very often, as well as the functionality that they offer in accepting disabled persons' rail cards, and the improvements to passenger assist. And I think yesterday we heard that the GBR ticketing app will allow people to book through their passenger assist as well as their ticket, which will be a massive step forward in making journeys easier for disabled people. And I think one of the other important things too is that we were very keen to make sure that the apps were not the only way through which people could access tickets, given digital exclusion amongst some disabled people and older people, that GBR will be selling tickets across the widest range of channels to make sure that they are accessible as well.
Okay, over to Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. So Ben, why do you feel that a fair and open ticket retail market is important to passengers?
I think we think that because the independent retail market has produced significant benefits, I think, for customers in the time that it's been in existence, heavily used, I think, by rail passengers. And I think the critical question in relation to the bill and the other mechanisms that will be in place once the bill's been passed is how we ensure that there is genuine, fair and open competition between GBR ticket retailing and the independent retailers currently or potentially in the market. There are various references in the government's documentation to the fact that they decided not to set up GBR retail as a separate entity, and that its management will be separated from the management of the operational and commercial functions of GBR. And colleagues may want to talk about this in later sessions, but I think there's a really important question around whether and how the code of practice on ticket retailing applies to GBR retail. And I think it will be worth interrogating whether and how there will genuinely be a free and open market for ticket retailing as we go forward. There are references in the various documents to the fact that the government appreciates the benefits of the independent retail market and wants to keep it in place. The critical question will be, how does GBR retail operate in that market, and will it have some kind of unfair advantage, whether deliberately or unintentionally?
Rebecca would like to come in.
Yes, Rebecca. Yeah.
Just on that, if I may, Ben, do you in effect think that the government is actually getting itself involved in something that it could just be leaving to the market, and that actually, going back to what Sue said in terms of what it's offering for that booking of accessibility, that actually the bill is sort of offering this amazing landscape that, you know, actually we might be better off developing what already exists rather than GBR starting from scratch?
Well, it seems to me to be logical and important for GBR to be able to sell its own tickets. It will be odd to preclude it from that. I think the question is, how can that be complementary to, and obviously it would be a single seller of GBR tickets as opposed to the multiple top ticket selling operations that we have at the moment. How can we make sure that that GBR function is complementary to and additive to the existing retail market rather than subtracting from it and making it less good for customers, I think.
Scott, you wanted to come in.
So thanks, Ben. This is an interesting area, I think, because it's not the case that these third-party resellers only exist because the current framework is just so, I was going to swear there, it's so complicated, and they've managed to decrypt it for users. But GBR should remove that. I mean, I've got the LNER app on my phone, and it's fantastic. So I'm not tempted to look at any of these other services. So is it not just a function of the current dysfunctional system, and that's what we're trying to get rid of?
I'm sure colleagues will want to talk about this in more detail than I probably can at this point. It seems to me that what the independent retail has done has found ways to, commercially sensible ways to provide a really good service to users. You may not be one of them, but it seems to me that as this system, this hopefully less complex system, but still be quite a complex system, evolves, we understand whether and how independent retailers can add value to the market alongside GBR retail. And you know, in the end, that will be determined by whether they go on being able to sell tickets successfully in the new system, I think.
Do you think do you think there's potential they'll bring more people onto the trades? Because obviously it's not in GBR's interest if they're simply giving someone else a cut of their profit. Do you think more people will come into rail because of these third-party retailers and the way they operate?
I think if it's as easy as possible to buy the best value ticket, then that ought logically to lead to more people travelling by rail. Certainly the current rail level of demand to be maintained, yeah.
Okay. Right, thank you. Back to accessibility per se, as opposed to the voice of people with disabilities. Rebecca.
Thank you. So promoting the needs of disabled passengers is only one of several matters GBR will have to take into account, and we've heard concerns about how accessibility will be prioritised against these. What guidance do you think will be needed about how to balance these considerations against each other? I'll go to Emma first and then come back to the room if that's okay.
Absolutely. I think we have already seen throughout rail that accessibility does get deprioritized in favor of other priorities, which is something that I'm very much hoping will not happen. I think in regards to this specific section to have regard to the interest, we really feel that that isn't sufficient in really holding that to account. As I mentioned, it doesn't really give any action that we can point to say this is upholding or this is having regard to. It's almost purposely vague so that it can be subject to what various actors think is promoting or having regard for, as opposed to what disabled people may view.
And on that point with accessibility, I mean, there's ultimately a double meaning to accessibility, isn't there, in terms of access to the actual trains and then accessibility to the system as a whole. So is that something that you think needs to be more explicit on the face of the bill as well?
I think it absolutely does. I think the more explicit, the better. I appreciate not everything can be put into, primary legislation. However, I think the lack of enforceable standards, the lack of enforceable actions is really why disabled people feel so excluded from the rail network at the moment, and why many of us face so many barriers. Because we have seen things like quite a lot of tick box kind of exercises that have been done in the past to show that they're consulting or doing things with disabled people or looking at the views of disabled passengers. But where's the action on that? Where is taking the feedback meaningfully and turning that into changes that will improve the accessibility to the network? We just haven't seen that. And I think the vague wording in this is really going to just perpetuate that.
Thank you. Is there anything, Ben or Sue, you want to add?
I know that it's not necessarily a popular provision, but the GBR will also be subject to the public sector equality duty, which doesn't exist at the minute amongst the talk. So that's an important part, and of course the EHRC have prioritised or have identified transport as one of their priority areas, so that we've got that sort of going on in the background as well. I think with all of this, and as Ben said earlier, we have to look at it in terms of the suite of documents that will be around the licence, the guidance, the directions that the Secretary of State can give, and the very clear commitment that we've seen thus far that people, and in particular disabled people, are at the core of the rail network. So I think all of that needs to be in play, but we, at this stage we will have to wait and see in terms of how that actually plays out.
Okay, thank you. Steph?
Yeah, on that detail, there's all of the nice aspirational policy. Let's not forget that good accessible policy actually benefits everyone, both indirectly and directly. But then there's the practical reality of, can I get from here to there if I'm wheeling? And the detail around that is often in accessible travel policies at the moment. Where in the new framework do you expect to actually see that detail? Is it in the guidance? Is it in the standards? Is it part of the licence? And perhaps, if that's not yet known, where should it sit? If I could ask Sue first, because you mentioned the detail, then I'll ask all three of you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the detail is, as ever, the devil is there, and we haven't seen that yet. What we do know is that the ATPs will be with the watchdog. We've always, as DIPTAC, taken a very close look at ATPs as they've been developed, which is, I suppose, with hindsight and preparation for the new regime. I think standards will be really important, and the watchdog has the ability to introduce those standards, particularly around accessibility, and with GBR being able to bring together the procurement power as well. I think that has the potential to make a big difference in the accessibility area as well, where we see such inconsistencies in terms of lift provision, etc., at stations and maintenance regimes. I think, as has been outlined in the roadmap, there are already measures moving forward ahead of the legislation to bring some of that together, so that we don't get the situations that we have at the moment, where we may have lifts in place which would allow wheelchair users to access the service, but they are out of order, and we don't quite know when they're going to come back in and what information disabled people can have. So there's all sorts of areas around those standards in terms of the hardware, but also some of the softer measures, particularly around customer information and the reliability of that customer information with regard to whether or not a particular facility is working on that particular day.
Okay. Ben, where should the details sit and who should be writing it down?
So it seems to me that how the network is made increasingly accessible needs to flow through from the long-term rail strategy, through the GBR business plan, through to the operating and investment decisions of the operating regions, through the guidance that the passenger watchdog will issue, and then into real detail in the technical, what does a station being accessible mean in practice in terms of how you design it, and to Sue's point, critically also how you maintain the infrastructure. So if the lift is broken, if the ramp is not there when I get to the station, it isn't actually accessible, even though in theory it might be. So I think what you want to ensure there's a clear line of sight from the Secretary of State's intentions and, regarding accessibility through GBR's intentions, right the way down to what a passenger experience is every day on the network. Can they get to the network? Do they understand the network? Can they move around the network in a way which gives them exactly the same level of accessibility as everybody else?
I thought we just need some station managers and a good complaints process. Emma, would you agree with that?
I absolutely would. I think in terms of the replacement of each talk having its own ATP, we have this chance to set standards, but standards are not helpful to disabled people unless they are enforceable. I think, this committee as well as other committees have acknowledged that even under the public sector equality duty, those sort of phrases like, having due regard, etc., are just not enough. I think in terms of who should be setting that, I think in terms of the current proposal for the passenger watchdog to set those standards, I think is in itself a good idea for who should be setting them, because they can get into that level of detail. However, without that enforcement power or that regulatory power in some way, those standards could quite easily be missed, as we are seeing every single day in terms of the ATPs that are already in place.
Right, are you
done? Yeah, thank you.
Done? Right, okay, Jacob.
Yeah, thank you. This is for Emma. You've recommended that there's statutory requirements for things like level boarding, accessible rolling stock and station staffing. How do you think that this should be implemented in practice?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question to answer. I think ensuring that rolling stock and station refurbishments meet clear, accessible enforcement specs is incredibly important. But what I think is not joined up at the moment is between rolling stock procurement and other aspects of infrastructure. So for what that we hear quite a lot is that level boarding isn't possible because of the need for freight trains to use that same network, and so it's very difficult to align sort of the competing needs. But what I think really needs to happen is a long-term plan when it comes to rolling stock procurement, how that's going to be invested as well, to make sure that there is a continuous improvement of that stock and that infrastructure, and making sure that they are marrying up as well.
Do you think that there would be a risk in putting some of these things into the bill that you've asked for, given the pace of technological change that happens?
I think that's a fair question. I don't, however, think when we're talking about staffing, that technology is ever going to be able to replace the assistance that only a human can provide. It's not as basic as, the only assistance that station staff provide is to put out a ramp for a wheelchair. They provide a huge amount of other support, whether that's being at a station to be able to unlock the toilet facility or the waiting room, both of which can have huge impacts on disabled people's ability to travel. They also provide sighted guidance for individuals who need that. They provide a lot of wayfinding support for not just disabled passengers, but all passengers that require that for various reasons. So I think technology we can't wait for technology to catch up to the needs of disabled passengers, but I don't think it ever will be able to fully meet those needs.
Okay, Ollie, is there anything still to pick up on representation, consultation?
Well, shall we see, perhaps, Chair?
Yes,
So,
go on.
yes. So, perhaps starting with Emma. I mean, clearly, a really important thing is making sure that there's really good consultation and listening with people who have disabilities, particularly as, generally speaking, people running such organisations don't, or often don't. So, what do you think should be specified in the bill about consultation, particularly on mechanisms such as the licence and standards that should be worked to?
Absolutely. I think in terms of consultation, one thing I would love to see that is very inconsistent is good consultation practices. So making sure that from the very beginning of every consultation that there are alternate formats for people with different information accessibility needs to be able to receive the information that is being proposed, and then to have accessible ways to respond to that and have sufficient time to do that. So that is something that I would absolutely like to see. But what I think is needed in consultation is that follow-up piece. It's great to have a fully accessible consultation. People submit lots of really important evidence or feedback, but where it gets published, where it gets acted on, I think is that missing piece that I would like to see, reasonable timeframes for reporting back on consultations, to have there be a requirement for any, improvement or plans that are being made off the back of that consultation, so that people can see their feedback be acted on and what is actually going to change. Otherwise, we're going to have more and more instances of, at least I know for disabled people, where they give their experiences, and sometimes these are really traumatic experiences that they have on the railway, and sharing that again and again to no avail. I think that's a reason that we've seen a real drop in the amount of disabled people who make complaints, because disabled people feel that if they even make a formal complaint, there is not going to be either a satisfactory response, or there isn't going to be systemic change, which is ultimately what disabled people have identified as their main reason for making a complaint, is to avoid that issue happening to them or to other disabled people going forward. So I think that feedback loop is incredibly important when we're talking about consultation.
Any other thoughts to add to what Emma said?
No, I think the point about having accessible formats for all of the consultations is a really important one, and we've seen some examples of that recently from the department, particularly around the aviation side. On the aviation accessibility task and finish group, it was one of those documents that was produced in a variety of formats at the same time, because that's also important that it's not 3 weeks later. I think in terms of consultation with stakeholders, in the Railways Bill response to the consultation, the government did say that the licence would include a requirement to engage with stakeholders, and I think Emma's absolutely right in terms of how that engagement is delivered is really important. It's not just paying lip service to engagement, but as someone coined the phrase, participative engagement the other day, which is difficult to say, but really gives the idea that it's a two-way street, and people do need to get feedback in terms of how their voices have been heard, and indeed whether or not they can be acted upon. And I think in terms of GBR, it's and indeed the transport focus, it's difficult to imagine how they would be able to exercise their duties without having effective engagement with disabled people. So we would certainly hope to see that.
Thank you. We've covered consultation and communication with disabled people, but what do you think should be specified in the bill in respect of representation of disabled people, such as on the passenger watchdog board? Any Sue, Emma? Emma?
I'm happy to jump in. I think, as I already mentioned, Transport for All is recommending for there to be a proportion required among the passenger council to have that representation of lived experience. It's incredibly crucial what that percentage is. I think it sort of remains to be seen in terms of what is feasible, but I think it absolutely needs to be in legislation, that there needs to be that lived experience representation. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see disabled people shut out of the new rail network.
Okay, Sue?
Yeah, I mean, I think the line that's been taken thus far is that Transport Focus have always had, as Emma's mentioned already, a good engagement with the disability community, and the government would expect that to continue. I think it is probably a point, though, that will be revisited, no doubt, as the bill proceeds. But I think it's particularly welcome that GBR will have someone on the board with the role of championing accessibility. I think that's very important as we move forward.
Thank you. And then finally in this panel, we've got a couple of questions, Elsie, on network access.
Thanks, Chair. I'm going to ask Ben about this first and then open it up if that's okay. So why is ensuring an open playing field through open access important for passengers? And why not, for example, not just ensure that GBR can run the network as best it can?
A bit like ticket retailing, we think that the services offered by open access operators have proved beneficial to passengers. They've increased capacity and provided a broader range of services, and also connected new places to the network. So, and the government seems to be saying that it wants open access operators to continue to have the opportunity to provide services. So we think it's important that that opportunity is there. Because it's possible that in future open access operators will spot opportunities that GBR hasn't, and will be able to provide services that will meet that demand that's currently not being met.
Okay, and you're not concerned at all that we could see discrepancies in the quality of service under GBR compared to those operating under open access?
I don't think so. I think, again, the question might be how the overall regulatory and oversight process works, both in terms of GBR operations and other operators' services. So you'd want to make sure that there was consistency in how those services were monitored and action was taken if performance targets weren't met, for example.
Okay, that's helpful. And yeah, Emma and Sue, I wondered if there's anything else you would like to draw the committee's attention to regarding the interests of passengers. Emma, could I start with you on that one?
I think, as I've already mentioned, the particular interest in the needs of disabled passengers is extremely welcome. There are lots of great things within this bill that I think presents a starting point, but would just like to see that be even more strengthened in explicit legislation.
Okay, anything from you, Sue, maybe on sort of network access as well, or?
Yeah, I was just going to clarify it was on network access. I mean, again, I am no expert on the provisions around network access, only that in exercising its decision making around that, GBR will have to have regard to the needs of disabled passengers along with other passengers, so that duty doesn't go away just because they're looking at network access. So I suppose at one extreme, if GBR was to allow an inaccessible service to have access, then it could be challenged as not having exercised that duty to the letter. And again, it will all very much depend on what the entire framework looks like. So I suppose in an ideal world, working as it's intended to work, it should ensure that the whole network is accessible, regardless of whether it's subject to open access or not. But again, I'm not an expert on that one.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of our panellists in the first panel, which we now bring our first panel to an end. Thank you very much for your evidence and the time you spent preparing for us today. As ever, if you've got anything you feel urgent that you needed to add, please do so. I'm going to suspend the meeting for a few minutes while our next witnesses take their places. The sitting is suspended. Order. Yep. So welcome to our second panel. Please could I ask you to introduce yourselves, starting with my left.
Good morning. Anthony Smith. I'm the chair of Independent Rail Retailers. That is the trade association for the main retailers of rail tickets in Britain and abroad. Our members collect about £5 billion worth of the rail industry's revenue at the moment, about half of its revenue, and pass it back to the government. We have 10 members. You'll recognise Trainline amongst those, but we also have other members, Trip.com, Omeo and others. They do three things. They sell tickets to consumers, they help businesses choose rail for staff travel, and they white label so-called a lot of services, including for people like Uber, allowing them to sell tickets. Thank you.
David.
Good morning, committee. My name is David Pitt. I am Vice President of Silverrail UK. Silverrail is a technology business that essentially provides services to a number of train operating companies in the UK. We work with national rail inquiries as well. We've been supporting national rail inquiries for some 20 years of journey planning. We also provide services around the world, so we have a deep-rooted expertise in retailing, but we are not a retailer ourselves.
Thank you.
And good morning, committee. My name is John Davis. I'm Vice President Industry Relations at Trainline. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. Around 18 million customers in the UK rely on Trainline, and we are proud to be a British company and one of the most trusted brands in UK rail.
Thank you. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. Why do you feel that an open market for ticket retail is in the wider interests of passengers? And would it not be simpler for passengers to have a single place to go to for tickets, which is what advocates of the GBR proposed approach would say? We'd like to start with that. John?
Dive in. So, how passengers book their tickets really matters, of course, because retail is the shop window for rail, and it's often a customer's first contact with the industry. And we help shape how people feel about rail, whether they trust the system, and ultimately whether they make a decision to travel by train at all. And I think it's important to note at this point that the government itself, in its consultation document in February, has already noted what it termed the significant value retailers add to the marketplace and the role that they play in driving innovation and attracting more customers to the industry. But to unpack that a little, competition in the retail segment has clearly driven up standards for passengers, which in turn drives up passenger demand. Our very low cost of sale reduces the subsidy burden on the taxpayer. And we have to constantly innovate to make rail travel as easy and accessible as possible. Customers always have a choice where to go to buy their tickets, so they have to have a reason to choose an independent retailer. We have invested £250 million in the last 5 years in our digital platform and our engineering architecture to give customers the very best experiences they have when they can travel by train. We bear all the costs and risks associated with that. In terms of the employment that we offer into the broader workplace, we are an innovative and exciting brand that attracts the very best talent in the technology industry from other big players who come to us, bringing highly skilled e-commerce expertise into rail. We have about 1,000 employees, half of whom are engineers, data scientists and technology specialists that create all the magic that customers experience when they use our retail experiences. And in terms of industry benefits, retailers have been at the forefront of, in particular, the digital ticket revolution in the UK. Now 50% of the tickets sold on behalf of the industry are digital. We've heavily invested in the barcode infrastructure that you see, so retailers contributed about 70% of the £30 million cost of upgrading the barcode infrastructure, again reducing industry costs. I wanted to pick up Scott's point earlier on to the panel before and slightly resist the notion that kind of fares simply, who'd have thought, resist the notion that fare simplification will in due course somehow reduce the purchase of rail travel to this kind of two-dimensional transaction, because retail is not just selling tickets, right? Travelling by train is a sophisticated and complicated consumer transaction, and it always will be. And this week, for example, we've launched a suite of enhancements called the Way to Train internally, but help customers navigate disruption, use artificial intelligence to anticipate it, present them with options of the things that they can do, claim their delay repay, change their plans if that's what they need to do. So it's never ever going to be just a two-dimensional problem about how to buy tickets.
Okay, thank you. So a lot of what John has said there is, I would echo. I think competition is paramount in this market. Essentially, ticketing and retail, especially in the digital sense, is the shop window for rail. Without that shop window, then obviously we suffer the consequences of not seeing increases in revenue and reductions in subsidy, etc. I think the competition that we see today in the market, it works. However, I think we have to bear in mind that we are essentially losing 14 brands from essentially the franchise space. That's 14 retailers that we have in the market today. And I think that market itself within the train operating companies has shown an awful lot of fragmentation, a lot of confusion for customers and passengers, and actually is quite at the centre of some of the issues that we see in the retail market today. I'm hoping and expecting with a GBR.com, we'll call it, from a retail perspective, a lot of that fragmentation will be removed. A lot of the simplification, which is not just about the product that you're selling, but it's actually how you'll fulfill to the customer, and how the customer is given journey information, how it's given both pre and post sales customer service, etc. So I think we have to look at the retail aspect as not just the ticket. It's very much about the wider experience that customers should and do expect from us as an industry to make their life easier to travel on rail.
I think this is a great opportunity to get rail retail right in Great Britain now. After 25 years of things evolving in an interesting way, we can actually get it really right now, both for passengers and for taxpayers. And I think at the heart of this, there's a lot to do with the accountability of Great British Railways. It will essentially have a monopoly on quite a lot of services and things it provides. Therefore, any area where it can be challenged and you can have competition will, in a sense, send a kind of electric shock through the system and will make it think about customers in a way that most businesses have to. Most businesses, competition and private money drives innovation, drives growth. Because if our members don't make money, if people don't come back to them and buy from them again and again, they go bust. That's a very positive force. You wouldn't expect your mobile phone provider to be just one provider, like British Telecom, imagine. You've got choice. That is what drives growth. And if the rail industry is going to prosper in the future, it's got to get more passengers on board. Costs are notoriously difficult to reduce. The subsidy, £2 billion a year, the government can't sustain that forever. So the only way forward is through growth. Growth is driven by competition. That's what our members do. That's why it's important.
Okay, Rebecca, do you have a
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question based on what you've just said already, and it was interesting to hear you mention the business aspect as well. I think I'd forgotten that we all use a business interface to buy, which obviously offers tickets and air flights and flights, sorry. Do you think, yesterday in his wind-up, the Minister said that, anybody that wasn't supporting the bill was denying a one-stop shop that should exist for ticket pricing, for ticketing, timetabling and accessibility. Do you think that the government is oversimplifying what it's trying to achieve, and that actually what you do already could be worked with rather than being scrapped consistently, and that actually the aims that the government is trying to achieve, which to me is essentially just the accessibility piece, could be done by the existing market rather than having to throw everything out and create something new that could take years, could also cost an absolute fortune, I suppose. I'd be interested to know about the cost aspect too.
Yeah, so Rebecca, exactly right. And I think that it is not, as Ben said in the panel previously, it is not irrational that GPR would want to have its own shop window, its own marketplace and all the rest of it. But for the reasons that the government has set out, the role of independent retailers competing alongside it brings so much, and we want to continue the innovation in the competitive market that we see today. The passenger assist piece is really interesting because we have been seeking to embed the passenger assistance function within the Trainline app for some years now, and the ability to have that has been resisted by industry and government stakeholders for some time, and perhaps it's now clearer why.
Yes, go on, Anthony.
I think your question's a good one because there's a double opportunity here. It's both for Great British Railways to have a competitor in terms of selling tickets, but of course Great British Railways will also be providing some of the infrastructure which ticket retailing will hang off. And I think there's an opportunity here again, a great opportunity to work with the private sector to really boost those systems. The current industry systems are a bit clunky, they're a bit out of date. There's a chance here to build something really good for the future around open data, around AI, to really help rail sell itself rather than perhaps just retailing. Because rail's good at retailing. Miss Smith, you want to go to Edinburgh at 12 o'clock on Sunday, here's your ticket. But have you thought of going to the Highlands on holiday for 20 quid this year? Rail could move into that sphere which airlines, restaurants, all sorts of other people move into. If you get the underlying systems right, there's a great opportunity here, but it's got to be done in partnership with government. You're absolutely right.
Okay. Ollie, did you want to have a specific... yes, go on,
can I just
David.
add to that? So certainly there is an opportunity for renewal. I would slightly challenge the concept of throwing away, is essentially what we have today. Essentially, the way the industry works today is we are based on a number of systems that sit within Rail Delivery Group today, and that essentially provides the backbone, and I don't see that changing. So I think from that concept, that does not get thrown away. I think from a cost perspective, it's very easy to look at this as a cost negative way forward, but actually what we have today, as I mentioned a moment ago, is we have 14 different retail platforms that are provided by the train operating companies, and actually consolidating those down from a customer perspective into one unfragmented solution for the customer, I think is a very positive way forward. And actually the revenue generated on the back of that, I would say, is positive, and that's where the government should be aiming to make its benefit.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, Scott, you're... Yeah, okay, being persistent.
So this is interesting because I think, if I was Great British Rail, I'd be thinking, why would I let somebody else sell my tickets? Unless they're going to bring more custom into the railway. And I met, I think, must be one of your members, Trip.com, and they were able to speak about how tourists coming into the UK, they buy the flight and train trips within the UK and even from the UK into France. So I got the benefit there. But otherwise, why would GBR let someone else sell their tickets? And something that came up yesterday, and one of the many demands on the bill was that the minister should confirm that there won't be any booking fees for customers who are buying tickets from GBR. But I guess that's, people are using Trainline, they're paying that booking fee because they think it's worth that extra money, the service you're providing.
Yeah, indeed.
But are you providing extra customers to the railway, and will you with GBR, do you think?
So the purpose of our existence is to grow the pie, but the danger is that you're just trying to get a share of the market that GBR would can service quite happily. Rather than bringing new customers in, all you're doing is taking a commission from the tickets that they would otherwise have sold. Yeah, of course, and that's in two parts. I think we've already established, because the government has recognised that independent retailers play a fundamental role in driving the innovation that does bring new customers to the railway. So we're in a place where the context sets the frame for that. I think it applies in two other ways. One is the conversation we probably need to have in the industry about the cost of sale, so the economics within which independent retailers work, the 4.5% commission that we pay is the lowest cost of sale in the industry, and in a broader cost of sale that amounts to, we think, around 10% of the industry's revenue. That is incredibly competitive. We bear all of the costs and the risks of investing in the technology that we do. But the other part of it, and why we should think of ourselves as valuable distribution partners to GBR, complementing them in the way that Rebecca says, is the reach into places that GBR itself would find it harder. So, speaking for Trainline, we operate in Europe. There is a European connection into St Pancras and offering customers the ability to do cross-border travel, come through the tunnel, out of St Pancras up the Midland Main Line, across the concourse to King's Cross up to Scotland, of course. Right, those are the opportunities that it may be better for us to assist more cost-effectively the government, and the government in its way would find it perhaps harder to reach. So I think there is room for all of that in this landscape.
Could I add to that, Chair?
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry, we're quite
Very
tight
briefly,
on time, but
very
go on.
briefly. GBR, of course, won't be the only tickets being sold. There's still open access operators, Scotland, Wales, London and others. And picking up from an earlier question, our members, some are quite small. They can focus on quite small businesses and institutions like Portsmouth Football Club supporters. They can get them using rail. Bath University, they get their staff using rail. GBR will never have that sort of micro focus.
Well, my LNER app, which is fantastic, and I hope GBR uses that as their app. I can buy Bloomer tickets on that as well, which I think is a good thing.
But the reason why it's good is there's competition. There's a risk if you don't have competition, it will atrophy. And ask LNER, does it cost them 4.5%, which is the commission that Trainline and others get? Does it cost them 4.5% to sell a ticket? Because I bet it doesn't. I bet it's more than that. And that's going to be one of the key features of the future, is the comparability. GBR is not a free cost of sale. Somebody's got to pay for it.
Okay, thank you. Lawrence, that takes us on to... You've got some questions.
Thank you, Chair. I understand the point about wanting to avoid distortion from a single dominant operator in the space, but that applies on the private side as well as on the public. It's a question for Mr. Davis. The Competition and Markets Authority puts 25% of market share as its indicator of monopoly status. Is Trainline below or above that market share?
So I think in terms of the segment share of the industry sales overall, I think through all of our portals we sell about 30% of the industry's tickets. Some of that through train operating company branded systems. But I think the thing to recognise in this market is that it is a free and open market. There are currently around 30 different places that you can go to buy your ticket. There is no compunction on any customer to come to Trainline. We don't hook them in and retain them through some Machiavellian means to prevent them going somewhere else. If they come to us, it's because they prefer to come to us, and it's because we make the process of buying a train ticket intelligible and a worthwhile transaction. So yes, we have been successful at attracting customers to rail, and that's where we find ourselves.
I mean, you say that there aren't hidden, effectively, means of keeping customers from returning to the app, but the ORR did require Trainline to change how booking fees were applied at the start of the booking process quite recently, and the Advertising Standards Authority said both that it was inaccurate for Trainline to say, and I quote, "You won't find cheaper fares anywhere else." They also said that advertising might prevent some potential customers from looking at alternatives. I mean, just looking today at some of the adverts that are still being run, there's an advert on social media at the moment that says, "Choose our app for all the routes and fares in one place." I mean, that's not literally true, is it?
In what way is it not true?
Because Trainline's algorithm, as stated, prioritises fastest routes and then the cheapest fares within that range of fastest routes. It won't show all of the possible routes and it won't show all of the possible fares.
Yes, but we have tools that make those options available to people. We have to serve a consumer population that wants the things that most people want to buy, and if they need to go and find other things, then we can help them do that as well.
I understand that, but it's not literally true to say choose our app for all the routes and all the fares in one place, is it?
I think it's a fine definition, and of course when we put our go-to-market campaigns out, we take advice externally, and we test the validity of the claims that we make, and that's the basis on which we publish them. And we do all of that in good faith, and you cite some places where authorities have questioned whether that's strictly correct, but we're content to comply with that direction. That's no issue.
Okay, so it's reliant on one of those bodies to make that enforcement.
Yes,
I mean, just Chair, if I may, just one more question.
Yeah, it's always about the bill.
Yes, but in terms of the current share and how that might be affected by GBR, I mean, last year Trainline paid its chief executive £5.7 million. I think, unless you're in a position to say otherwise, that makes that person the best remunerated person in the entire transport industry. I mean, how is that justified?
It's not something I can comment on. I mean, we can come back to you with a bit more detail on that. But there is a market for technology expertise in the way that we serve the industry that we do, and you have to reward and remunerate the right people in a way that's comparable for the markets that they're employed in.
Well, if you could come back to the committee with that comparative, that would be helpful because it is a publicly funded industry.
Yeah, thank you, Lawrence. Ollie.
Right, I've got lost, Chair. Where are we going next?
Okay, I'll ask it. So it's actually back to you, John. You've suggested that GBR's retail arm should be structurally separate from the organisation. Yeah. Why? And then I'll come back to Anthony David very quickly. Do you agree, yes or no? And how are there examples of how other countries with large state-controlled approach
yes, of course.
operators approach this issue? So as briefly as you can, John.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So we think that the decision not to separate out GBR's online retail function is a structural design flaw, meaning a high likelihood that the government's objectives for the reformed rail industry will not be met. Online retail, GBR's online retail will be a new vertically integrated state-owned retailer which will compete with independents. But under those plans, of course, GBR will define and operate the market, including setting its economic terms and participate in it. And this duality of role creates a conflict of interest, the type of which were acknowledged in the Bill's own impact assessment and also by the CMA. So I think government objectives for fair and open competition will suffer unless this conflict of interest is properly addressed. And whilst the government has set out a number of measures, we don't think that they go far enough. And you asked, Chair, about European comparators, let's say. So, of course, Trainline does operate in other jurisdictions. Our experience in the EU is that where you don't have the right kind of market structures in place, the only recourse becomes via external competition challenge under existing frameworks, and in both Germany and in Spain. In Germany in 2022, Spain in 2024, the competition authorities have found that the state operators with similar vertically integrated structures have abused their dominant positions.
Okay, Anthony, very briefly. Yeah.
Yes, just to totally back that up. In an ideal world, you'd have GBR Retail separated out into a separate company whose accounts were audited and you could see the cost of sale. And I think this is very important in terms of this keeping GBR accountable. If the Office of Rail and Road is going to be able to compare the retail activities of the different participants, it's got to be able to compare apples and apples. If it's not clear what it costs GBR Retail to sell a ticket, the ORR is going to be sort of comparing apples with pineapples, and that's going to be difficult. They're not going to be able to exercise their Competition Act duties, and I think that level of transparency is very, very important.
Okay.
Chair, can I just add?
Go on, David.
So from our perspective, as I say, we're not a retailer, and we do have a slight different view from this perspective. We tend to look at GBR obviously as a retailer as part of a large operation that is going to be going through an awful lot of change, including fares and ticketing reform. And I think it's, whilst absolutely living in a level playing field and not having any kind of suitable benefit over and above third-party retailers, I think we also have to be conscious that we don't starve the retail arm of GBR from essentially its inception, and therefore making sure that it is a success for the greater good of GBR and the passenger is very important.
Okay, thank you. And I think mention was made of data, so I'm going to go to Alex, if that's all right. 21. Oh, well,
okay, I'll go 21.
Okay.
I'll carry on. Yes.
Yeah, go on, Alex.
So the government has acknowledged the need to ensure that GBR is not treated favourably over any other retailer. Do you think that there are sufficient measures to ensure that independent retailers have got access to the same data and systems that GBR's retail arm will have? And perhaps you could just explain what data it is particularly that you feel that you need in this open data that presumably you want.
I think that's a very good question. One of the good things about the new setup is going to be the creation of a code of practice which will bind Great British Railways in its dealing with third-party retailers. And I think obviously some of the things you would expect to see in that would be provisions about data. The odd thing is that currently structured, the code of practice won't apply to GBR retail, which seems very odd. It only applies to the third-party retailers. So to get a sort of reciprocal, sensible arrangement on data, you've got to have everybody playing by the same rules, everybody agreeing to share the same things and agreeing not to share certain things, because there are commercial interests at play here as well. And what data is it you're after? I think my colleagues might be better.
Maybe you go. Yeah, I mean, for me, this comes. It's more about the customer and the passenger. So, in terms of to answer your question directly, first of all, Alex, essentially the data is driven by the systems from RDG, Rail Delivery Group, that we've spoken about already. So in terms of having creating access to fares, to timetable information, all of that kind of data, that is there today. It is implicit within the accreditation process for any retailer that they have to be able to sell any ticket across any service in the land. So that is kind of implicit within the system we have today. So that has to be bound into what we have in the future, most definitely.
But is it? Because it's my understanding that the different train operating companies at the moment provide slightly different data. Maybe, maybe John could answer that in a minute.
It's true to say that industry data is served up to retailers to consume at quite a granular level. And train operators play a role in that. So in 14 different places they upload reservations into a reservation system, and perhaps some train operators do it in slightly different ways than others. So there is a consistency to be had here. But David more broadly is right. I mean, underpinning it, we as a community of retailers need just the access to the fares, the features, the products, the services, the systems and the data that GBR itself is going to have on an equivalent basis. And under the code of practice, parity of market access in that regard is really important. And it's not just the data about selling train tickets, as Scott and Rebecca have talked about. It is the access to products and features like the ability to book passenger assistance, the ability to help customers directly with their delay repay claims, the ability to allow independent retailers to also participate in the loyalty schemes that the train operators find it within their budgets to fund. It is those sorts of things that also need to constitute parity of access for independent retailers.
Okay. And surely this might perhaps be a two-way street. So I'm wondering what data you'll be willing to share back again.
Shall I take that one just quickly, because it comes up quite often, and you are absolutely right, and this is a conversation we quite frequently have with the industry and with government. We advocate for an innovative and a positive position for sharing of data, because understanding how customers interact with the industry, what they do, what they buy, where they travel, what they've paid, and what might encourage them to do that again is an incredibly powerful tool, and one that the industry hasn't really worked out how to get its arm around yet. But we need to work out the frameworks within which all of that can be exchanged equitably, but it is absolutely the right question.
I absolutely concur with that. I would say, coming back to my point a moment ago, this is all about the passenger. How do we give the passenger, the customer, the best service, the best information, the cheapest price, all of that? And by essentially concentrating around the data, that's where we need to do this. I think part of the question may be alluding to current practices where some train operating companies have their own tickets essentially, or their own pricing for just their services that they don't necessarily share. I think that's something that has to be eradicated. GBR is essentially a GBR broad in terms of, and it also gives out that same price and that same ticket to all retailers.
Anything to add, Anthony, very briefly?
Don't worry. I think the prize you outline is that kind of aggregated data about what's happening to consumers and who's buying what and why, but keeping it at a very macro level, because at the moment I think the industry sees the third-party retailers as a bit separate, a bit add-on and something to be dealt with. The future's got to be a partnership to come together for growth.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca?
So is there... Well, I've got one question, but I just want to ask something that links to it, if I may. So there's a bit of an elephant in the room, it feels like, which is the National Rail platform, because obviously National Rail is already the national platform, I'm assuming, and data is already being shared. So are we perhaps in danger of getting a bit red herringed with the GBR thing? Because actually the data sharing that is going to happen for a GBR platform is surely the data sharing that's already going on anyway. So they're kind of creating a problem that doesn't need to exist.
I'll answer that. I think we're halfway towards solving the problem.
Okay.
So the rail delivery group absolutely have a marketplace of data. I would say it's not necessarily it's there, but how accessible it is to organisations like ours, you certainly have to go and find it. There is a lot of consolidation that has to take place between GBR, Rail Delivery Group, all the organisations that we spoke about, and I think that's the crux of the problem.
And then, so my actual question, sorry, but it was kind of comes off of that, is do you think effective provision is being made to ensure that there is a competitive tender process for GBR's retail's back office systems? I don't know who wants to answer that.
I will just purely because it kind of hot off the press in the last week or so, GBR have come out with a market engagement process. Which alludes to there being that tender process that's going to be undertaken.
What that looks like, you're not sure yet.
Okay.
I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of industry data that is shared and is common at the moment in terms because consumer and passengers can search on trip.com for train times and on National Rail. But there's a difference thing between having a single source of the truth because you don't want to double book seats. But on the other hand, you want to give our members the creative space to customise that information that's coming from the source so that you can add features, you can update it, you can constantly make it relevant.
Okay, thank you. Ollie?
Should we go, 23?
Yes.
Lovely.
Yes.
The ORR will have oversight of the retail market, but do you feel that its powers go far enough? And what needs to change on the face of the bill, in your view, to ensure that fair and open retail competition that you'd all like to see? So perhaps we'll start with Anthony this time.
Thank you. In an ideal world, I think on the face of the bill, you would have a separate retail arm of Great British Railways, which was therefore identifiable and accountable. That would be in an ideal world. I think what we would like to see on the bill is more detail about what the ORR's duties and what resources and tools might be made available to them so that they can oversee the market successfully and resolve disputes. I think they've got some of the skills there already, and as you're aware, they have the Competition Act powers in respect to the railway as well, and that will be applied in this area. So I think the bill could be strengthened in that respect.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Anthony's answered most of the question, but certainly what I would like to see adding to the remit of ORR, it's kind of something that doesn't exist at the moment, and we've had much of the opposite actually in the last several years coming out of the Department of Transport, and that's essentially we need a driver for innovation. The one thing that franchising has done in the last 20 or so years is every time a franchise changes, that's typically the point where innovation gets kicked in. So certainly from our perspective, John and I have had many years of competing to essentially be the technology provider at the point of franchise change. And that's when the innovation starts to kick in. My concern with GBR, there is no change essentially. Where does the innovation come from? And I would like to see that built into what ORR push for.
Okay, sorry.
Just to conclude, I think to build on what's been said, three things crucial to equipping ORR with meaningful enforcement oversight. Firstly, to have ex-ante powers so that it can do things before harm has occurred and not just after harm has occurred. We think the ability to issue financial penalty is probably important. And then beyond the ORR enforcement regime, that there should be the appropriate appeals regime that goes along with that.
Okay. Thank you very much. We are going to have to finish that panel. We're slightly overrunning, so thank you very much. But if there's anything else you think you would have liked to say more on, including, I think we slightly jumped over the code of practice, but anything else, then please do write in. So I'm going to suspend the meeting for a few moments. As we change over the panels, the meeting is suspended. Order. Welcome to our third and final panel of today. So could I ask you both to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Alex Robertson. I'm the Chief Executive of Transport Focus.
Good morning, I'm Alex Campbell. I'm the Director of Policy and Insight at Transport Focus.
We might have to use the term Mr. this time. Two people with the same name. Okay, so could you outline how the role of Transport Focus is going to change under the bill, and how, particularly important for us, is how do you see this being of benefit to passengers? Mr. Robertson.
Yes, I will go first. So first thing to say, and I'll take this through perhaps kind of step by step. The first thing to say is that it will be built out of our existing functions, and we're responsible for representing rail users in Great Britain at the moment, but also bus users in England outside London and users of the strategic road network. So it will build on that multimodal work that we already do and the insight that we already have from passengers, and we think there's strength in that. And then in terms of the changes, so it gives us an increased role as a statutory advisor. So we'll be consulted formally on some of the key documents that will determine the priorities for the railway in the future. And part of what we do now and what we think this will help with is making sure that issues and priorities that passengers care about are addressed from the start and we're not dealing with problems later. There is also a general duty for us to be consulted on matters that might affect passengers, things like fares and timetabling. I would expect us to have a role in making sure that the voice of users is heard before decisions are made, not so that we have to challenge them afterwards. The third way in which our responsibilities are changing is that we are acquiring new functions, and essentially we're bringing together the customer passenger focused elements of the work that the Office for Rail and Road does into our organisations, and then it, as I said before, I think sits well alongside our existing duties. So we will take over sponsorship of the Rail Ombudsman, and we will set the consumer facing standards for accessibility, passenger information, delay, compensation and complaint handling. Bringing that together allows us to set standards in the right place, make sure that issues that are coming through from the front line in terms of complaints are dealt with properly. We can get into some of what that might look like in practice, but it puts us in a position where we can set standards at the right level and make sure they're followed through. And then finally, the final area is that our general powers are being strengthened. So we will be able to require information to be provided to us. We will be able to require improvement plans to be produced. We will be able to refer matters to the ORR for enforcement. So a range of powers, I think, and maybe we'll get onto this, how we use those in this new railway, I think will be extremely important.
Okay, and obviously, given you're both from Transport Focus, you don't one or other of you will answer the questions as you see fit. I mean, I suppose the question is, how will passengers notice a difference, and what will that difference be between, from the proposed passenger watchdog compared with Transport Focus now?
Perhaps I could give an example, Alex. You might pick up some border points if I've missed anything. But let's take passenger assistance failure. Yeah. So I hope what we would be able to do, and certainly the legislation put us in a position to do this, is be able to take a different approach at an individual level and also at a systemic level. So the complaint would be made that there had been failed passenger assistance. And what we would do is be setting standards for how complaints are handled. Now, you want that complaint to be handled properly first time round. And in doing that, we would be able to look at the level of compensation that people receive for failed passenger assistance. At the moment, it's possible only to receive, not in all cases, but it's still possible to receive only the value of your ticket for failed passenger assistance. Now, I think that is plainly wrong. I come from a complaint handling background at the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, and what you would typically be getting for public service failure is a compensation relating to your distress and inconvenience. So there's potential with these powers to look at what that might look like in practice. So better individual redress or different form of individual redress. Secondly, what we'd be able to do with the sponsorship of the Ombudsman and the wider powers that we have is pick up that individual issue, either for that person that's repeatedly happening or from seeing multiple complaints, identify a systemic issue, and then go to the GBR and say, look, this is not good enough, something needs to happen. And as I mentioned before, we have a range of tools then available to us to make sure that action is taken. So that's one specific example which I hope illustrates it on a very important issue, but that would be also applicable in a range of other areas. Alex, do you want to add to it?
Yeah, if I could just add, Alex mentioned at the beginning our multimodal remit, so we'll also have that broader, when we're looking at the rail passenger experience, can also consider the bus passenger experience, and as we know, most journeys will involve multiple forms of transport. So by coming across to us, okay, it won't necessarily be grounded in a quasi-regulatory role in terms of standards on buses and so on, but we can still nonetheless take that much broader, holistic picture and experience and bring it together to help with our advice back to Secretary of State or GBR or whichever other stakeholder is relevant.
Okay, thank you. Jacob.
Yeah, thank you. What role did you have in shaping the bill's provisions around the passenger watchdog?
Fairly extensive. I mean, let me maybe give you a sense of that. So we've been talking to the department. We knew that obviously that there's the aspiration to create the passenger watchdog, and we were keen to make sure that was thought about properly. We responded to the consultation independently ourselves. We took our own view on it, and we published our response, which you may have seen in April. Since then, we've been working with the department. So we are. I mean, in very broad terms, Jacob, we are content with what's in the legislation. We think it will work. We know there's a lot more to be done to stand it up, to get it to work. And of course, through the parliamentary process, there may be changes and improvements that are made, and we would respond to those too. But we're happy with where we are, I think, at the moment. Alex, is there anything you want to add on that?
Maybe just to note, as you would hopefully expect, we've been working closely with the department, but also the ORR and the Rail Ombudsman through a working group, just to make sure that the operational and practical matters that we'll know we'll have to get into in a lot more detail next year are well underway. And that extends more broadly to things like the GBR licence, which of course, as you heard previously, will be consulted on later at some point next year. And again, we're expecting now to be working quite intimately with the department and others on the detail of that.
So from what you said, is the provision within the bill broadly what you recommended, and are there any areas where it perhaps didn't go as far as what you were wanting?
There's one, although let me be clear what I mean by that. So we had said that one of the additional powers that we wanted was to be able to call representatives of GBR and others involved in the railway into meetings, so we could hold them to account in public. I think that's very important. We have received assurance from the government that we will get that power. It'll probably be through the licence, though, rather than the face of the bill. I think we are agnostic on the route through which that power is set, but we think that is important. I think more broadly, holding GBR to account in public will be quite an important feature of how the new system works, and that power and that clarity that should be expected that people would come in and answer questions from us, I think is important.
Are there any parts where you think it doesn't go far enough, where it needs to be strengthened in terms of some of the provisions that are in the bill for the passenger watchdog?
I mean, no. I mean, that's not to say, of course, that through this process it couldn't be improved. But certainly from where we've been sitting and the questions that we've been asking, we're content actually that it does give us both the kind of additional functions which make sense, which I mentioned earlier, but also the additional powers that we need to exercise our role.
Okay, thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Chair. The passenger watchdog will have the power to set standards on behalf of passengers. How do you envisage that those powers will be used? How are you going to what are your parameters going to be when you're setting those standards? So what are you going to kind of have regard to? Are you going to be thinking about, as well as exactly how the passenger feels, the value for money, the capacity on the railway, etc.? Either of you.
I'll start, and then Alex has been starting to look at this, but I'll give you perhaps something more general to begin with. So I think it's very important that we start from what passengers want and expect from the railway. That's the kind of unique thing that we bring, and we have a deep understanding of that already. So we would take the 4 areas of standards and look at what passengers want from the railway and think about how the standards could focus on the outcomes that passengers receive, their experience, as opposed to perhaps the processes. So that would be one general starting point. But how we do it, I think, is very important. I think you're alluding to that, both particularly on the accessibility standard, working with disabled passengers to make sure that it's co-created with them, that it does genuinely reflect the priorities they have. I think it's also very important in setting the standard to think about how it would be monitored, so that it can be, again, moving into a place where we're able to clearly demonstrate that the standard's been hit in terms of people's experience. There may be different ways to achieve the right outcome for passengers, but make sure that works. The other thing, and I do think this is important, and it's in the legislation, we do need to do this with ORR, and ultimately it will be signed off by the Secretary of State as well. So they are the enforcement body for this. So we need to work with them in developing the standards, as well as making sure that they are the right standards. Alex, do you want to say a little bit about how we, well, a bit more on that?
So, I mean, a couple of other points on the general duties. So, as you'll be aware, we've got a particular duty to have regard to the interests and needs of disabled people. We've also got a requirement to take into account public spend. Now, that doesn't mean we'll have a team of economists poring over every proposal that comes forward, but it needs to be in the back of our minds as we're considering things. More broadly, we're now deep in discussions with ORR about, because they have those standards already at the moment, they are responsible for them, thinking about the practicalities of how they would then come across to us. As I think our colleagues mentioned when they gave evidence to you, there's potentially a transfer of staff involved, so we need to be sensitive to that. And of course, one of the other key elements will be the GBR licence and how that interacts with the standards. We expect that to say a little bit there about the need to meet the standards, but there will be detail that needs to be worked through in practice.
Okay, thank you. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. We've heard the view that the passenger watchdog will lack the necessary independence, power and resources to effectively stand up for the interests of passengers. Would you agree with those concerns? And if you do, what suggestions might you make for changing the bill to avoid that risk?
Yeah, good. Yes, so perhaps I can say something on that. So we actually said in our response to the consultation that it was very important that our independence was guaranteed in any future arrangement. And we've had assurances from the government that that was the case. Now, I've been Chief Executive here for 2 years, and what we would want that independence to mean is complete independence in decision-making and advice that we provide. And I have certainly, that has been my experience in the last 2 years. You will remember, I'm sure, just over 2 years ago, the government of the time went out with a consultation on closing ticket offices. We opposed every single one of them. That clearly wasn't what the government wanted us to do, accepted our advice, and we made that independently. So I do think it's very important we've had that assurances, and I think that must be the case going forward. The other point, Ollie, you're raising is about resources, and again, I think you're right. I mean, let's be clear. We are creating a single, very large organisation that will be a very powerful force in the rail sector. We must have independent, well-resourced organisations to challenge it, and I'm confident that the Department for Transport sees it that way too.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca, yeah.
So, excuse me, so just looking a little bit more deeply at the relationship with the ORR in particular, what do you see your role with your relationship to the ORR being under this new system?
So our current relationship, and Alex, there's definitely one you'll want to pick up, I'm sure, but it's generally positive at the moment. So as you might know, we share an office with them in London. As it happens, we actually also share an office with them in Manchester. Our general working relationship is good and close. We've also worked with them on specific pieces of work. A piece of work some of you may be familiar with that we did them recently on stranded trains. But obviously the relationship is changing. We're taking, there'll be some colleagues who transfer across, and we need to make sure that particularly the areas where we are setting the standards and the monitoring, and they are doing the enforcement, that must be set out properly and work very closely with them as we set that arrangement up. Alex, but we have started some of those conversations, haven't we?
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting we've already got quite a strong overlap with those specific areas that are coming across to us, the accessibility complaints, delay repay and so on. So it's not as if it's an area that we have shown no interest in. They're really core to the passenger experience. So we're working through with those teams exactly how they manage those processes at the moment. There will be elements of the process which will sit with ORR, at least in the short term, around some of the data collection. So we need to make sure that flows through to us, that the arrangements are appropriate and in place. And then crucially, the potential handover to enforcement is something that will to avoid duplication, to avoid ORR then having to feel it has to do a separate investigation itself from scratch. We need to make sure that they're happy with what we're providing to them. As Alex mentioned previously, ORR also need to approve the standards that we will be setting. And I worked in a regulator for 10 years, not the ORR. there are processes that go through an organisation which, the fact that we'll be slightly outside of that doesn't actually fundamentally change it. A compliance team and enforcement team will still need to be reassured that the people who are providing them with the information in the case have done their job, and there needs to be processes in place to do that.
And do you think that the ORR will be able to enforce things that you can't? And do you have confidence that they'll have sufficient powers to escalate issues that the watchdog isn't able to do?
So I think we see our role as being that one right up to the point of enforcement. So through the full suite, through the speaking to people informally on a telephone call or in a meeting, through to more publicly publishing results and findings, and if necessary, if we get the power and the license, bringing people into a public meeting and so on, and challenging them publicly in this sort of forum. But ultimately it's the ORR who will enforce against the license. So I don't think there's anything else in the ORR license. I mean, that's a question more for ORR, but I don't think there's anything there. Certainly from our perspective, it's really clear. We hand over at that final point to them.
Just on that point then, if I may just finish, would you welcome further powers for the watchdog so that you actually are able to take more of that enforcement? Because I think the concern is that if you get all of the nice, you've done all the nice, let's have a conversation about this and try and solve it and see if it changes. And then if you get to a point where you can't do anything, do we need to be clearer that you could potentially then enforce, rather than the ORR effectively going right back to the beginning to have to go through all of that process again? Keeping passengers as the focus, obviously, because then that just elongates the time it would take to get anything done, basically.
That last point is key. We don't want the entire process to go through again.
So do you need more in the bill then to make sure that doesn't happen?
So I don't think, because I think the question of us having enforcement as well, clearly if that's what Parliament decides, then we'll work with that. But that is a fundamentally different beast. We're not an enforcement body at the moment. It requires a whole different set of legal and regulatory skills to be in place, which is fine if that's what's required. There is that whole question about regulatory uncertainty. If you're on the receiving end, like which body is it that's actually going to regulate against your license, and potentially having two regulators dealing with the same part of the license. I think from my experience in regulation, that becomes difficult if you're on the receiving end. It's difficult if you're on the regulatory end, but certainly if you're on the receiving end. So I mean, again, if Parliament calls for it, we will do it, but I think it's pretty clear for us, pretty clear for the ORR, and we can work with that.
Okay, thank you. Alex May, you want to come in?
Thank you. Another Alex, you see. We've mainly been talking about individual passengers. One thing that concerns me, particularly in the early days, is about standardisation, as all of the different train operating companies and everything else is brought together. And then I imagine that even after we have GBR, there'll be some forms of regionalisation within it. Is part of your role at all making sure that there's consistency for passengers in different parts of the country?
Question.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think I think it would depend on the issue and where consistency of experience is important. And I think actually one of the areas where consistency of experience is very important is in terms of accessibility. You are describing those, some of the decisions that are to come with the creation of Great British Railways, and I was mentioning the power earlier for us to be a statutory advisor, and we would expect to be involved in those conversations and bringing in a passenger perspective into conversations about standardisation and where there should be local and regional variation. Now, some of that we can do from our existing knowledge, but we would also potentially be wanting to go out and bring the actual voices of passengers into that conversation so we could understand whether or not the choices that they made are in fact the right ones.
I'm trying to understand, I'm thinking, parallels with some of our own casework, where there's a big issue that's a systemic issue, and it might not come from a complaint, or it might not come from many complaints. Does the process have to start with a or multiple complaints, or can you get working on an issue, such as, let's say, level boarding, or say the ticketing system isn't producing the best outcome for passengers? Can you get where you might not have complaints, but there's an issue that is providing inadequate what service that could be better for passengers? Can you get working on that, and do you feel you will have the power to change either through enforcement or some other tools?
Yes and yes. So in terms of identifying issues, and I think this is one of the strengths of giving it to us as an organisation, there are a range of different sources of information that we would want to use to identify an issue, from operational data about what's going on the railway so we can spot a problem early, to complaints data, to information from surveys that we run. There was a survey which we'll be publishing tomorrow. It's an industry-wide survey, but we will produce a league table of all passengers' experience on each different train operating company against a range of measures that passengers have said are important to them. So that gives us the opportunity to go in without a complaint. I'd say from my experience on previous roles of complaint handling, those bigger picture bits of data will sometimes miss the individual experience, which identifies a systemic issue directly affecting a proportionately small number, but nonetheless significant number of people very severely. I do think accessibility was one of those topics.
Which we're about to move on to.
Which we're about to, and the other, sorry, yes, and just super briefly, is also the involvement of passengers in the solution is very important. Yeah. Maybe we can talk about that, but that doesn't need to. You don't need to wait for a complaint to come through on that.
Okay, including possibly rolling stock design.
Quite. So we did some work some time ago with Mersey Travel in Liverpool, the new rolling stock there, which, as some of you will know, has much better accessibility and level boarding. We set up a passenger community that advised during the design and build phase all the way through genuine co-creation. We'd want something like that to be replicated more widely.
Okay, moving on to accessibility, Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. At the moment, Clause 36 says that the Passengers Council must have particular regard to the interests and needs of disabled persons. We have heard suggestions that this could be alternatively worded as a duty to promote, or perhaps akin to the public sector equality duty to narrow disadvantage faced by disabled passengers. Do you have a view on that? And how would such an alternative wording work in practice?
So perhaps we'll go first with that. So, I mean, we're content with the wording of the legislation at the moment, but perhaps, so before getting too far into what the alternatives would be, accessibility is already a very high priority for our organisation. It's a key priority in our business plan. It's one of the objectives that we have. We think it's extremely important that it's stressed now and in the future through the changes in the Railways Bill. To be honest, I don't know what an alternative for what the effect of an alternative form of wording is. I suppose sitting in the position that I am, knowing the conversations that we have, we will absolutely be prioritising accessibility, and we're going to ask ourselves some pretty hard questions, frankly, to make sure that we're ready, as well as as everyone should do, to take on the responsibility that we're properly resourced to do it, that we've got the right range of experience to do it. We will absolutely be doing that anyway, regardless of what the legislation says.
Mr. Campbell, do you have a view?
Just really to add, as working for Alex, it comes from the top and it is permeating through the organisation, and when we go to the board, it's front and centre. I find it quite powerful, the words in the legislation, but again.
And who should actually be responsible under the new system for deciding whether accessibility is good enough? So say, for example, a passenger has a very poor experience of passenger assist, or there are level boarding issues that they pronounced at a particular location. What should that passenger's actual experience look like of raising an issue and then it getting assessed and potentially addressed?
So this goes to complaint handling, and as I said before, I've got a background in this, and it's extremely important you get the first dealing of the complaint right. So first of all, people have got to know how they can complain. A lot of people aren't aware of how they do it. They might find it difficult to do. They might not also be convinced that if they do complain, anything will happen. So you've got to get that first, at the kind of point of need. We'd have talked about it in a different organisation. Get that right, that awareness and information right, dealt with properly. So we're going to set standards for complaint handling to make sure that's done right. What you also find, and again from previous experience, is the Ombudsman is the backstop. And if the Ombudsman makes decisions consistently in one way, then nobody likes having their complaint overturned, do they? So you can get the system lined up so you get it right first time. Now, in terms of who makes the decision, there was a debate, as you will, and I'm sure it's come up, about whether or not that should effectively be us absorbed into our organisation, or independently through the Rail Ombudsman, but sponsored by us. We favour the option which is in the legislation being sponsored, and the reason for that is that an ombudsman, you need to act independently and impartial. And let's be clear, we are not impartial. We are sticking up for passengers. And if you want to have independent binding decisions and in fact be called an ombudsman, you need to have that independence in your decision making. But we'll be setting the standards, and we'll be taking the systemic issues out of those complaints and making sure as far as we can that they're addressed within the system.
I mean, one of the issues which is probably going to come up frequently is the one that's written into legislation, which is the contrary duty to have regard to public funds. I know this is an issue that comes up a lot with requests for new bridges, for example, level crossings.
Lifts.
Exactly. How do you see this working? Are you going? Do you think the same tests which are already applied under the current system are going to be carried through, or are you working on a new alternative way of balancing those competing demands?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I think it's fundamental to how actually it's the same duty that we have, similar duty to the one we have at the moment. And actually, you might want to pick up some thoughts on what it might mean in practice. But through some of that will be, we will get engaged with that through the consultation on the priorities for the railway, the development of the business plan, making sure that within a fixed envelope of money, the right passenger priorities are reflected. I think it would be easy for us just to keep asking for more and more things that cost more money. So getting involved in the prioritisation of the railway at an early stage, I think, will be one very important way of doing that.
And then finally, Chair, say a complaint has gone through the process and the watchdog and GBR just end up in diametrically opposed points of view. How does it get resolved? What mechanism will there be to break the logjam?
To talk through that bit.
Well, if it goes to the rail ombudsman, then the ombudsman, assuming the same enforcement rights sit with the ombudsman upon GBR, then they'll be able to find in the individual complainant's favour if that's the appropriate outcome. But that's in respect of individual complaints.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And what about if it's a systemic issue? One that bugs most of us is lifts, access for all, and you know, what do you think will happen in terms of when there is that fundamental difference with GBR saying we can't afford it, and the watchdog saying we really need a timescale and a target and all of that?
If it's a systematic failing against the standards as we see it, as we conclude, then we would then pass that on to the ORR for enforcement, and then they would be in the position then of having to take that final economic call, if you like, the cost benefit.
Presumably at some point the Secretary of State would get involved. Or there may be
That's right. I mean, this is slightly more OR's territory than ours, but ultimately the Secretary of State, and I think we have to be careful how the Secretary of State use this, because you do want to maintain the operational independence of GBR to plan and make decisions properly, but there is the power, I think it's described in the accompanying words with the legislation, to course correct through issuing guidance and then failing that direction.
Okay. Thank you. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. The bill does not set out any statutory requirements about what composition should the Passenger Watchdog Board should have. Would you welcome it mandating specific requirements, particularly in order to ensure adequate representation of people with disabilities? What are your thoughts on that?
So first of all, I think very important issue. We have a board at the moment where we have lived experience of being a disabled passenger on the board, as well as broader expertise and knowledge about accessibility. I think it's absolutely critical, Alex was mentioning earlier. It creates a culture on the board, and I feel certainly our feet are held to the fire on that, as they should be. I mean, as you probably know, the appointment process is not through us, it's through the Secretary of State's public appointments process. We have not said that we need the kind of the change that you're talking about, partly because at the moment we do have a degree of representation on the board. Of course, and this is true of all things, if Parliament to legislate for it, then of course the process will be adapted, but it's not one entirely within our gift in any case.
Okay. Thank you. Steph.
Thank you. Transport for All, we've read, have suggested the passenger watchdog itself should have powers to issue enforcement notices when there's a breach of an accessibility provision. What do you think the pros and cons of this would be?
It does touch on some of the things that we were talking earlier. I think it's important that the rail ombudsman has binding decisions, as they would do as an ombudsman on individual cases. I think I mean, we were talking about it before, where we've reached an impasse being able to point it to the OR for enforcement and ultimately the directions and guidance that are available to the Secretary of State. I think, and this isn't a point particular to accessibility, it is important that GBR has the ability, I mean, it needs to get it right. This is not about the legislation, it's about the culture, the priorities. It needs to be absolutely hardwired into GBR that accessibility is a priority. The thing I think we need to be slightly careful of, and I'm not sure quite how this would play out, is having several different organisations that can actually tell GBR what to do.
Well, could I gently suggest it might be more equivalent to the sorts of enforcement powers that civil officers have and that, say, traffic enforcement officers have? For instance, a notice that requires something to be done or a penalty paid is quite different to the judgment made at the end of an investigation. Is there not a role for that on-the-ground detail to be part of the enforcement process?
We will have the ability to issue request an improvement plan, for example. So
But that's not a do this or else, is it? That's not a sort of, you must do this now or there'll be immediate consequences.
yeah, but I think it goes back to the point earlier, when you have overlapping regulators, that starts to create a degree of uncertainty amongst people on the receiving end of the regulation.
I'd respectfully disagree. I think there's the parking enforcement officers in my constituency who issue fines and penalties for drivers. That's very much at the lower end of the spectrum. There seems to be no real conflict there with the judicial system or anybody else in the middle. Do we not need some form of actual practical stop, do this differently type system that's not about requirements to improve or anything like that? It's about a very particular decision that's been or not been made at a particular time.
I understand that, and I think I guess there's perhaps there's sort of two things. So what are those powers what you're mentioning, and who exercises them? Now, in terms of who exercises them, as we talked before, I think having one enforcement body, if you like, in the system is probably right, on the ORR, and for us to be able to pass issues at the right point across to them, I think that makes sense. The escalation we were talking about before does ultimately lead potentially to the Secretary of State directing or issuing guidance that could course correct, require someone to do something differently.
But the Secretary of State doesn't want to write an enforcement notice about a broken lift. Don't we need some way of getting this stuff routinely to be prioritised by network managers?
I mean, I very much agree that needs to be done. I think how you create the right environment in which it's done through the priorities that's set in the business plan, and you're checking those and you're challenging those. Some of that is through us, some of that is through OR. That looking at from an efficiency perspective as well. I mean, let's be clear too. A lot of this will be through the public pressure that we provide. Failed lifts, bringing people in, producing reports. A lot of this scrutiny will be done in public, and it will be quite hard to hide from it.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thank you very much, and thank you for your evidence and for the time you spent preparing. We've heard from all the panels, very helpful, and again, do feel free to write in if there's anything you feel you would have liked to have added, or whether or not we asked it of you. We're going to reflect on the evidence we've heard today, and we look forward to our penultimate session in the Railways Bill in a week's time, and that concludes today's meeting. Order.